Now it's very interesting that some of these ideas are specifically mentioned by the Buddha. Take the idea of beginninglessness. Somebody once asked the Buddha, how did it all begin? And he very clearly said, and I quote, "Undetermined is the beginning of the universe. The furthest point of beings moving on from birth to birth, being bound by ignorance and craving, cannot be known." Now that's very interesting. You see what he has said? He hasn't said there isn't a beginning. What has he said? It can't be known. There's a difference, isn't there? Why can't it be known? No, he hasn't said there's no beginning. He's just said we can never know. Why can't you ever know the beginning of everything? Why? But why? No? Why can't... Let's say there was a Big Bang. There probably was. But we can't know 100% for certain that that's true. Why not? Why can't they confirm it? It's too far. I mean, if somebody says to me, 68 billion years ago, there was a little man on the planet Earth. Well, that may be true, but how can I know? Is there any evidence? I wasn't there. Not only wasn't I there, it didn't happen yesterday, it happened 1,000 billion years ago. How can I possibly know? Have you got a washing machine in your laundry? I don't know, but I could very easily find out. I could go to a house, find out where the laundry is, and have a look. I could verify it through my own experience. But something that happened millions of years ago, how can I possibly know? It's beyond my experience. So this is why the Buddha says, it cannot be known. So all these other religions, they say, we know. But in actual fact, they don't know. They're guessing. Some of them are quite, in the case of science, there's a very good guess. Because they're not dealing with gods and theories and legends and that. They're looking at the facts. Sometimes we can look at the present, and from how things work in the present, we can infer that it might have been like that in the past, and that's what science tries to do. Religion, on the other hand, generally has cosmic eggs, God saying, let there be light, or whatever. So the Buddha's idea, in a sense, corresponds with science's idea. We can theorize, we can guess, we can even make a good guess, but we can't really verify for ourselves. The second thing here is, and this I find very remarkable, that the Buddha seemed to have understood this idea of an expanding and contracting universe. So, in one place, he says, sooner or later, there comes a time when, after a long period, the universe contracts. Then, sooner or later, after a very long period of time, the universe begins to expand again. Now, why that happens and the details, he doesn't give that. But the Buddha did not have an idea of a static universe. A universe that came into being and it has remained the same ever since. He seems to have understood the idea, which is very similar to the most contemporary scientific theory, that the universe expands and contracts, coming into being and passing away and coming into being again is like a cycle. Now, in the few places where the Buddha does talk about what the universe is like, This is rather interesting too. What is the universe like? So, when you were at school, or if you've looked in an encyclopedia or a science book, you get a rough idea of the main things. What's there in the universe? There are planets. We live on a planet. There are stars. What's the closest star to the Earth? What's the closest star to the Earth? You should have done that at school. You're young, but you're not that young. What's the closest star to the Earth? Oh, what? What's the closest star to the Earth? Of course. What's the difference between a planet and a sun? A planet and a star. A planet is a round thing that moves around a star. What's our star? It's up there. It rises every morning and sets every evening. You must have heard of it. It's called the sun. Okay. So the closest star to us is the sun. Now we think, wow, the sun. The sun, compared to other stars, is a tiny, minute thing. Compared to our Earth, it's gigantic. It's so hot that we need air conditioners. It gives us all that light every day. The moon is a satellite. Okay? Because the moon doesn't have its own light. Where does it get its light from? It reflects the light from the sun, that's right. And it's a satellite because it moves around a planet. So a planet moves around a star, a satellite moves around a planet. And there are even some moons that have moons, but that's another story. So there are stars and planets, and then there are things like meteorites, space dust. And then what happens is we know, because if you look up into the sky you can see it, there are what called galaxies. And galaxies are systems where vast numbers of stars, planets, space dust collect together. So if you look up into the sky, you see many stars at night. You see one star at day. What is it? The sun, thank you. At night time, the sun doesn't go off. It simply, we've moved in the other direction, so we can't see it. And because we don't see the light from the sun, we see the light from the other stars. And if you look across the middle of the sky, you see there actually, this looks like a sort of lots of stars sort of clustered together, and we call that the Milky Way. And in actual fact, what that is one arm of a vast collection of stars and meteorites and planets called the Milky Way. So our star, and Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, are all on one tiny branch of that vast galaxy. And these galaxies are like wheels. They tend to be flat, circular, and they often have big spiraling arms on them. So we can't see the whole of our galaxy. We can only see one arm of it, which we call the Milky Way. Now, if you get a telescope, now our galaxy, I don't know how far it is, but it's thousands of millions of light years across. But if you look from our tiny little planet up into the rest of the universe, you find that there are millions of those galaxies. In fact, they now believe that there are hundreds of millions of them. It's inconceivable, but we do know it's true. Some of them are circular. Some of them are circular and flat. Occasionally, two of them collide together. And we call them galaxies. Now, each of these is made up of hundreds of billions of stars, planets, flying rocks, etc. And the remarkable thing about these is there seems to be some center, energetic center, which makes them move around each other. Now, once again, the Buddha has some interesting things to say about this. And it seems in this sense he was influenced by the ancient Indians. Now, one of the great contributions that Indian thought made to human thought is Indians have always been able to think in very, very large numbers. So if you take the Old Testament, the sacred books of the Christians, they believe that the universe was created in 6 days. 6 days? And that it was created about, long time ago. Long time ago, 3,000 years ago. What? They were never able to think in cosmic terms. They were like, we say in English, a frog in a well. You know what a well is? You dig a hole in the, and the frog sits in the bottom and he says, "I'm the center of the universe. This is the whole world." That's what they were like. The ancient Indians were not like that. They were able to imagine vast numbers, vast distances. It's a special trait of Indian thought. That's why they always make very good mathematicians. So the Buddha seems to have been influenced by that. And he too was able to imagine a vast universe. So in some scriptures he talks about what he calls chakavalas. And this is a very interesting word. Chakra means a wheel, and vala means a world. So in some of the scriptures where the Buddha is talking about the nature of the universe, he says the universe is made up of chakavalas. Now, as soon as you hear that word, the first thing you think of is, well, that sounds very much like what astronomers call a galaxy. And not only does he talk about chakavalas, he describes them having thousands of chakavalas in the universe. He calls them lokadatus, world systems. Now once again, the Buddha was not an astronomer and he wasn't a scientist, so he doesn't give any details. But very clearly he had some idea of what we today would call galaxies. And another interesting thing about his description of the universe is he very clearly had an idea. He could think in terms not of 6 days and 3,000 years, but in terms of vast distances, not only in space, but in time. So, for example, in one place, he's talking about distances in space, and he says that in the universe there are thousands of suns, thousands of moons, thousands of chakavalas. Now scientists today wouldn't talk about thousands, they'd talk about millions. Nonetheless, the Buddha was able to get some idea. And then he says, as far as these suns and moons revolve, shining and shedding their light in space, That far extends the thousand-fold world system. And in it there are thousands of suns and thousands of moons. Now there are several things here which are interesting. First thing is he talks about galaxies. And he calls them chakravalas, which means wheels. And we know that galaxies are wheel-shaped. The second thing is he says they revolve. That is, they turn round. Again, we know from astronomy that that's true. They do turn around. Look it up in a encyclopedia or go to the library. Get a book on the universe. You'll see it there. And the third thing is that he says that they are vast distances in space. So he says, for as there are thousands of suns, and for as far as the light of those suns extend, that far extends these galaxies. Now he doesn't measure it, but obviously his mind was able to conceive of a vast universe. Now until fairly recently, except for the ancient Indians and perhaps the ancient Chinese, people couldn't think beyond their own little world. Take the Chinese, for example. What's the ancient name for China? I can't remember. What does it mean? Was that? The country made for Chinese people. I thought it had a different meaning. What does it mean? What's that? Yeah? Central Plains. I thought it meant the Middle Kingdom? Central, or the Central Kingdom, something like that? Why did they call it that? Oh, because we're the centre of the universe, of course. The Chinese always believe there's China, and there's America, and Germany, and France, and the ancient Indians. Not the Buddha, but the ancient Indians, they called their land Majjhima Desa, the middle world. Why? Oh, anywhere I live is the middle of the world, of course. People have always been like that. People who live in villages, they think, well, there's our village, there's New York, there's London. People have always been like that. The Buddha certainly wasn't like that. He was broad-minded enough to realize that there was a vast world beside his own, and that there was a vast universe beside his own. People's imagination was very earthbound. Now, the Buddha sometimes, when he was talking about the nature of the universe, he used the word kappa. Now in Sanskrit, the word kappa is kalpa. Kalpa. And it means an inconceivable length of time. So he said, for example, that it takes 1,000 million kalpas for the world to expand and contract. And somebody once asked him, a kalpa? How long is a kalpa? Or kappa, sorry. And he said, well, imagine Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world. Now, and imagine a man had a silk handkerchief, lovely silk handkerchief, and once in 100 years he went to the top of Mount Everest and hit it once with his silk handkerchief. Only once, not twice, once. By the time that mountain had worn away, that would be a kalpa. That's what he said. That's a long time, isn't it? He wasn't joking. He was trying to give people some idea of how long the universe has been around. Now it's very hard to do that to just the ordinary person. It's even hard for us to think of 1,000 years, let alone 1,000,000 years. So he used, very skillfully, He used this idea to give people the impression of vast periods in time. I always love that story. I think it's an example of the Buddha's sense of humour, but also of his skill, but his sense of humour. You can imagine also Edmund Hillary, Tenzing Norbu, climbing up through the snow, with their gas masks on. They finally get to the top, Mount Everest, like the Singaporean expedition did some time ago, and they plant the Singaporean flag on the top. And then one fellow says, "Wait a minute," takes out a silk handkerchief and he goes, "Hold on a minute. Boom. We'll be back in 100 years to do it once again." And by the time that mountain had worn away, that would be a kappa. So he used that to try to give people at least the impression, the idea of vast periods of time. Now, what does all this mean? What is the significance of all of this? From a Buddhist point of view, it isn't very much. But from time to time, you will meet people who will tell you, "Oh, we know how the universe was created. God did this. We've got the answer to all of these questions." Listen to what they say. Does it correspond with what science and astronomy says? No, it doesn't. The world wasn't created in 6 days or 10 days or 1 week or a month or a year. The world isn't 3,000 years old. The universe is trillions of years old. It has no beginning. It has no end. Any scientist or astronomer will tell you. Now, the Buddha's idea about the universe is not identical to the scientific one. But I'll say this. Of all of the ancient religious ideas about the universe, its origins, its structure, the Buddha's one is closer than all of the others. And I asked myself, why is that so? Did the Buddha have a telescope? I know he didn't have. Did he learn it from others? Did he just make a good guess? I don't know, because he doesn't talk about this subject very much. He wasn't very interested in this. But this is what I think. I think the Buddha was an incredibly remarkable person who was able to do something that most people can't do. That is, detach themselves from their own tradition, their own conditioning, and just look at things fresh and new and see what information they can get from it. I think that that's what the Buddha was able to do. I don't think he had any supernatural ability that enabled him to see the nature of the universe. I just think he was a very clear-minded person, and this gave him a very accurate, or a relatively accurate, idea about the nature and the structure of the universe. So how does that all, why is all that significant to us? We're not going to talk about creation, the beginning of the world, the beginning of anything. We're not going to talk about it again. Because from the Buddhist point of view, this subject is of no interest at all. In other religions, they talk about creation, the beginning of everything. In other religions, they talk about the creator, that being or that deity who is supposed to have created everything. Buddhism is not interested in either of these ideas. So if the others are interested in it, why isn't Buddhism? Good question. I would say because fundamentally Buddhism is different from most other religions. Its main concern is not about the big guy up in the clouds. Its main concern is the human heart and mind. This is how Buddhism sees this question. If I knew how the universe began, If I knew how old the universe was, if I knew about how God created the universe, if I knew how many stars there were in the universe, would that help me in any way to be a better person? And the answer to that question is no. If I was having difficulties in my marriage, or if I was having a quarrel with my neighbour, or if I was suffering from anxiety because I thought I might be retrenched, and I went to a counsellor, "Sir, my wife and I are having difficulties in our marriage." Or I went to a psychiatrist and I said, "I'm suffering terribly from anxiety." If that happened, and the marriage counsellor said, "Oh, you're having trouble with your marriage, is it?" I know the solution. There are 653 million stars in the universe. There you go. How's that going to solve my problem with my wife? If I'm suffering from anxiety and I go to a psychiatrist, he says, "You're suffering from anxiety." I'm sorry to hear that, but I know how to treat that. Just hold on a minute. Oh, here it is. God created the universe in 6 days. There you go. How would that end my anxiety? It wouldn't make any difference at all. And that's why Buddhism is not interested in these subjects. The primary concern of what we're going to be exploring over the next few months is not about God, the external world, the universe, but myself, or ourselves, our relationship with ourselves, and our relationships with each other. In other words, the day-to-day nitty-gritty aspects of living. How can I become a better, happier, more loving person? In other words, developing a good heart in Buddhism is more important than speculating about the origins of the universe. And that's why in Buddhism we don't deal with this subject very much. Okay. That's all I've got to say for this morning. That's the first lesson. You'll notice that that chapter is broken into 7 parts. Between now and next week, I'd like you to go through that chapter, read it again, see if you can keep in mind maybe even just that one word, Cakkawala. If somebody asked you, what does Buddhism say about the universe? You say, well, did you know that the Buddha spoke about Cakkawalas? And they say, what? Galaxies. Did you know that the Buddha spoke about kappas, vast distances in space? Pretty much like what scientists talk about. Well, yeah, okay, but if you don't believe in God, who created the universe? And you can say to them, well, as far as I'm concerned, developing a good heart is far more important than speculating about how the universe began. Keep those ideas in mind. Now, before we finish, and both this week and next week and every week, we'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions or seek any clarification about what we've spoken of this week. So if there's anything anybody would like to ask or talk about before we finish. Okay. Anybody got an Encyclopedia Britannica at home? I believe it. Nobody's got one. Amazing. Oh, you can do, yeah, okay. Look up on the internet what it says about galaxies. Look up what it says about light years. Look up what it says about the origins of the universe. You'll find there are actually 3 major scientific theories at present. The one that we've talked about is the one that most closely relates to Buddhism. Anything else? Okay. What I would ask you to do is don't read next week's chapter. Read and reread this week's chapter and leave next week's chapter for next week. Okay? Before you go, put your name down, mark it off. There's also a name and an address book if you'd like to put your name and address there so that we can notify you when we have other activities. You're very welcome to do that. We have some books for sale plus some free books. If you'd like to take some, please do so. And usually we finish each class with chanting 2 verses that the Buddha spoke, which are in the Buddhist scriptures. And these 2 verses, to me, epitomize what the Buddha's teaching is all about. Mano pubangama dhamma, mano seta mano maya. The word mano in the Buddha's language means mind. And what it says is, everything is made of mind, depends on mind, is influenced by mind. If you speak and act with an evil mind, evil follows you. And then the second verse says, Mano pubangama dhamma, mano seta mano maya. Everything is made of mind, influenced by the mind, depends upon the mind. If a person speaks or acts with good intentions, good follows them like a shadow that never leaves. And I always chant this verse, firstly because I like it, and secondly because it sums up to me a point which I think all Buddhists should remember. Buddhism isn't about ghosts, it isn't about gods, it isn't about anything like that. It is primarily about my heart and mind. And so it's a very good way both to begin and end any talk on Buddhism. So both this afternoon, and each week we will end by chanting these 2 verses, and we will do so this morning. Okay. Mano